The dinner table is bathed in soft candlelight as Bradley raises his glass, his voice laced with pride. I gave all my mother's money to my wife. Still, the words hang in the air, but I don't react, my fingers gripping the edge of my untouched plate. As the scent of roast chicken fills the room, I feel the weight of the ledger hidden in my bag. While their lies spin around me, the truth feels heavier than ever. That's when I know. It's time to show them the receipts. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The chandelier above the dinner table cast a soft golden glow over the polished oak surface, its reflection dancing in the wine glasses like ripples across a still pond. The scent of roast chicken mingled with rosemary and garlic, but it was the silence hanging in the air that felt most palpable. Eleanor Whitcomb sat at the head of the table, her eyes narrowed slightly, observing her son, Bradley, as he poured wine with an exaggerated flourish. His movements were careful, almost rehearsed, as if he were performing in front of an audience that couldn't quite see the strings he was pulling. Bradley's smile was charming, though it didn't reach his eyes. He had always been good at playing the part. And tonight, he was playing it well. To family, he said, his voice smooth and confident, and to the future. He raised his glass, and Mara, sitting beside him, clinked hers against his with an enthusiastic laugh. It was the kind of laugh that might have been genuine if you didn't know the woman as well as Eleanor did. A sound of amusement, but one that came too easily. Too rehearsed. Well, since Brad gave me all of his mom's money, I guess I should be grateful, Mara said, glancing at Eleanor with a thin smile. The words hung in the air, sharp as broken glass. June's hand paused halfway to her wineglass. Her expression shifted, one of shock, then a hint of disgust. Eleanor's fork, suspended midair, hovered in place before she gently set it down on the plate. The clink of metal on porcelain somehow too loud. Bradley's grin never faltered, his eyes not meeting Eleanor's as he took another long sip. It's fine. Mom doesn't care about money anymore, he added, his tone casual, dismissive. Eleanor's heart didn't race. It didn't leap into her throat. It simply stopped. It wasn't the first time they'd made a claim about her finances, but something about the way Bradley said it. So easily, so confidently, settled into her bones with a chill that didn't thaw. She glanced across the table at June, who was staring at her plate now, unable to hide the confusion on her face. The air in the room thickened, the polite clinking of silverware and glasses suddenly feeling like a cover for something darker, something unspoken. Mara's gaze lingered on Eleanor for just a moment too long before she returned her attention to her husband. Her smile was no longer the easy fake charm it had been moments before. It was something else now, an arrogance, a certainty. Eleanor's lips barely moved as she spoke, her voice cool and even, the way it always was when she made her exit from the room. "Excuse me," she said, setting her napkin down with deliberate care. "I'm not hungry anymore." Her plate, nearly untouched, remained a stark reminder of the meal they had shared, but she was no longer part of it. Her chair scraped against the hardwood floor as she rose, and for a brief second, the others fell silent, only for the sound of Bradley's laughter to fill the void, too quickly, too harsh. "Come on, Mom," Bradley called after her, his voice too bright. "Don't take it so seriously." Eleanor didn't respond. She didn't need to. She walked out of the room with slow, measured steps, the coolness of the hallway air embracing her as she passed the framed family photos on the walls. Each one was a moment in time, but now they felt like nothing more than a fading history. She made her way to her study, the room where she kept everything, kept her, in order. The door clicked softly behind her as she stepped inside, the darkness of the room swallowing her whole. Save for the soft glow from the desk lamp. Her fingers moved almost automatically, pulling open the drawer where her ledger sat. It was the real one. The one she had never shared with anyone. The one she had never intended to. She had kept meticulous records over the years, yes, but there were some things even she hadn't been prepared to confront. Not until now. As her fingers brushed against the leather cover, the weight of what she had heard, what she had known for so long but never had to face so directly, settled into her chest, like a stone sinking slowly into water. She opened it, and the numbers stared back at her. The checks, the transfers, the discrepancies. It had always been there, hiding in plain sight, buried beneath layers of trust and familial obligation. But now it felt as if she were unearthing something long dead. The night had only begun, but she already knew. This would be the end of the charade. She could feel the quiet hum of certainty vibrating in her fingertips as she began to write. The soft chime of her phone interrupted her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. A voicemail from Nora. Her thumb hovered over the play button, the words already settling into her mind before she could hear them. They lied with dessert still on their lips. Eleanor smiled faintly, a ghost of amusement crossing her face as she clicked the message. Nora's voice, calm and knowing, spilled out. "It's all there, Eleanor. Every last detail. You have everything you need." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of what was to come hanging over her like a storm cloud ready to break. This had been coming for a long time. It was time to make sure they couldn't escape it. She opened the ledger again and began to write, the pages filling with ink as the truth, quiet, patient, and undeniable, began to take shape. It was time to show them the receipts. Eleanor's study was a quiet sanctuary, its dim light flickering over the mahogany furniture as the weight of the evening's revelation settled into her bones. Her fingers hovered over the old leather ledger, as though the inked pages themselves might give her the answers she needed. But no, the answers were already written. She had seen the numbers, the dates, the transactions, and now it was time to make it real. The cool hum of her desk lamp was the only sound as she carefully began pulling together her records. A stack of checks, bank transfers, tax returns, notarized statements. Everything she'd kept in meticulous order, as though she could always be ready for a moment like this. As though she knew one day her son's lies would be laid bare. A deposit of $212,000. A loan for their new home, not a gift. The words on the page jumped out at her. There it was, the proof. Her son, her only child, had taken what was hers without asking, without care. And now he had the audacity to claim it was all given to his wife. The receipt from the bank was clear. The money had been transferred from her personal account, marked as a loan, with a due date that would never arrive. She felt the sting of betrayal in her chest, but it was a dull ache now, familiar, like a wound that had already healed over in silence. Her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking her focus. It was Nora, as expected. Eleanor answered quickly, the voice of her old friend calm and steady. "I've been through everything," Nora said, her voice firm, knowing. "It's all in the file. You need to see it all laid out. This will make it unassailable." Eleanor's fingers moved instinctively as she scribbled a note on a piece of scrap paper. Whitcomb, unpaid debts. The file would be more than just a compilation of numbers. It would be a reckoning, a statement, a record of everything they had taken from her. She glanced at the stack of paperwork again. Her mind moved swiftly, sorting, categorizing. Mara's trust fund paperwork was riddled with inconsistencies, more holes than truth. The more she looked, the more Eleanor could see the shape of the lies. She wasn't just compiling records, she was uncovering a secret history that her son and his wife had believed would remain hidden forever. June's voice echoed in her mind. The discrepancies in the trust paperwork. They're right there. It's just a matter of connecting the dots. With meticulous care, Eleanor flagged each document that didn't match. A loan filed under the guise of a gift. A trust fund account with paperwork so flawed it was almost laughable. As she worked, June's quiet presence seemed to hover in the background, adding pieces, pointing out red flags. The young woman's analytical mind sharpened the focus of the investigation, and together, they built a case Eleanor never thought she would need to make. By the time Nora arrived the following morning, the room was filled with neatly organized stacks, each one marked, flagged, and ready. Nora glanced at the files, her eyebrows lifting in quiet approval. "This is airtight, Eleanor," she said. "No one will dispute this." Pastor Boone, too, had been a constant presence, a steady, calm force. He had known Eleanor's family for years. He'd witnessed the slow unraveling of Bradley's promises and the shifting dynamics of his marriage. He had always been a man of principle, unwavering and meticulous. They gathered in Eleanor's study, the three of them. Nora skimmed through the file, nodding as she read. Pastor Boone, ever the voice of reason, folded his hands in front of him. "You've covered every angle," he said. "There's no way they can deny this." His voice was the kind of calm that anchored Eleanor's growing resolve. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she picked up the receipt, the one from the bank. Her mind was clear now. She knew what she had to do. She placed it carefully into an envelope, the paper feeling heavier than it should. She didn't need to write anything. The receipt would speak for itself. Without a word, she sealed the envelope, her gaze unwavering. It was time to send a message. Later that afternoon, the envelope was delivered, placed in Bradley's mailbox without fanfare. No note. Just the cold, hard truth in black and white. Bradley wouldn't see it coming. Mara wouldn't either. But they would, eventually, understand. Eleanor sat back in her chair, the weight of the moment sinking in. There was no going back now. And for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt something unfamiliar. A sense of peace. It was the kind of peace that only comes when you know the truth is on your side and you're ready to watch the world learn it too. Outside, the evening sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. The world outside was calm, but inside Eleanor, something had already shifted. She wasn't going to wait for the storm. She had already made it. The phone rang, breaking her thoughts. It was Bradley. Her thumb hesitated over the screen, the vibrations feeling almost too loud in the silence. No note, she thought. No words needed. But he would speak soon enough. The photos Mara posted sparkled with the gleam of newness, the perfect reflection of a life that didn't belong to her. The gleaming new dining set, the imported rugs draped artfully across the floor. Each piece a silent boast, a claim to something Eleanor had built over a lifetime. The images were bathed in soft light, a curated story of success and wealth, of a life she had not earned. Eleanor's eyes narrowed as she scrolled through her phone, the images loading one after the other, until the truth was staring back at her with sharp, deliberate clarity. She recognized each item, the floral pattern on the rug, the design of the hand-carved chairs, the delicate porcelain on the dining table. She had once picked out every single piece, each one carefully chosen and paid for. "They bought it all with my equity line," she thought, the words unspoken but burning through her. June's voice was quiet, but it cut through the moment. "They bought it with your equity line, didn't they?" Eleanor sat back in her chair, fingers lingering over the screen. Her thoughts swirled, but the sharpness of June's observation brought clarity. They assumed, she realized. They assumed that she wouldn't notice, that she wouldn't keep track of what was hers. But she had. Always. "They never asked," Eleanor replied softly, her voice tinged with a bitterness that hadn't fully surfaced until now. "They assumed." A small, bitter laugh escaped her. Assumptions. That was the game they were playing, wasn't it? Assuming that family ties and her silence would bind her to their plans. Assuming she wouldn't fight back when it came time to claim what was hers. Nora was already working on the timeline. The quiet clicking of her keyboard filled the space as she pieced together a precise history of every questionable transaction, every withdrawal that didn't make sense. Her document, meticulously drafted, now had Eleanor's initials in the margins, each one a seal of authenticity. Pastor Boone, too, had been busy. He'd been updating Eleanor's estate, revising the provisions. When he first began to question Bradley's intentions years ago, he had never imagined it would come to this. But now, the truth was undeniable. 60% to June, Pastor Boone had said, flipping through the papers, and 40% to local financial literacy nonprofits. It's the right thing. We can't let them claim more than their share. Eleanor had agreed without hesitation. Her trust in June was unwavering. She had always been the one to stand by her side. The rest would go to causes that helped others, real people who cared about integrity and fairness, not the hollow displays of wealth and deception that Bradley and Mara had embraced. And with that, a new clause was added. No contest. No inheritance for debtors. Bradley and Mara's names would be erased from the future that Eleanor had planned. No more pretending. No more borrowing on her back. If they wanted her wealth, they would have to fight for it. And they would lose. The day of the brunch arrived, and Mara's carefully curated world was in full display. The air in the house was thick with the smell of cinnamon and fresh pastries, but it was all background noise to Eleanor. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, none of it touched her. She received a notification that Mara had tagged her in a post. The caption was as hollow as the life she was trying to project. Grateful for her generosity. The words stung, but Eleanor wasn't surprised. She knew the game they were playing. It wasn't enough to take what didn't belong to them. They had to gloat about it too. Show the world how grateful they were, as though her sacrifices meant nothing. With a slow, deliberate movement, Eleanor clicked on the post. Her fingers hovered for a moment. Then she typed her response. "You'll return it in full." The words sat on the screen for only a second before she pressed send. No need for anything else, no explanations. Just the quiet certainty that the time for games was over. She wasn't going to watch them flaunt what wasn't theirs without consequence. As her phone buzzed with a flurry of notifications, Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. The world, she knew, would turn against them soon enough. Mara might pretend to be grateful, but gratitude couldn't hide the truth for long. Minutes later, her phone rang. Bradley's name flashing on the screen. She let it ring twice before swiping the call to silence. He was too late. Mara's post had been the first mistake. The response was already out there. It had been sent, and the truth was now in the open. They would have to deal with it. Eleanor sat back, her gaze on the quiet stillness of the evening. Outside, the shadows were beginning to stretch longer. Soon, they would have nowhere to hide. And for the first time in a long while, Eleanor didn't feel the weight of anticipation. She felt the calm that only came when the final pieces were in place. There was nothing left to do but wait. And she would wait, because the storm was coming, and it would come for them. The phone buzzed again. This time, Eleanor answered. She didn't speak immediately. "Mom." Bradley's voice came through. Too smooth, too practiced. "What is this? What are you doing?" Eleanor's voice was calm, unwavering. "The same thing I've always done, Bradley. Taking back what's mine." There was a long silence on the other end. Then, his voice, a whisper this time. "You think this is over?" Eleanor smiled just a little. "No, but I think you will." The old grandfather clock in the corner of the room ticked softly, its rhythm a steady reminder that time, like money, was never truly on anyone's side. The table was set for game night: clinking glasses, snacks arranged with precision, and a deck of cards ready to shuffle. A typical family gathering where the only thing sharper than the competition was the polite smile everyone wore to hide their true intentions. Bradley leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the armrest as he looked around the room with that smug, charming grin of his. He was trying to act casual, to keep the tension in the air from settling, but his eyes darted nervously between his mother and his wife. There was something about tonight. He could feel it. The way Eleanor was sitting so still, her eyes calculating, like she was already 10 steps ahead of him. "Well," he said, stretching the word out with exaggerated nonchalance, "I guess we could call this old money versus smart money, huh?" The word stung like salt in an open wound. Bradley had always considered himself a master of the game, always moving and manipulating behind the scenes, but tonight he had underestimated the one person who knew his every move. Eleanor said nothing at first. Her eyes were fixed on the table, her hands resting lightly on the edge of her wineglass. There was no flicker of recognition, no trace of acknowledgement in her expression, only the quiet stillness of someone who had seen it all before and was now waiting for the moment to strike. Then, without warning, she pushed a large stack of documents across the table, the pile of paper landing with a soft thud. She looked at Bradley and Mara with a coolness that would have frozen a lesser person in their tracks. Bradley's eyes widened. He leaned forward, his grin faltering as he saw what lay before him: annotated loans, copies of canceled checks, tax returns, all the evidence neatly organized, a roadmap of deceit. Mara scoffed, clearly uncomfortable with the shift in energy. "You're really keeping score?" she sneered, her voice dripping with disdain. She shifted in her chair, arms crossing over her chest defensively, as if trying to shield herself from what she knew was coming. Eleanor's gaze never wavered. Her voice, when it came, was calm, almost too calm. "Only when someone announces a win they didn't earn," she replied. Her words cut through the room like a blade through velvet. June sat silently beside Eleanor, watching the exchange with a quiet intensity. Her pen moved rapidly, recording every word, every gesture. She knew better than anyone the importance of documentation. This wasn't just a family game anymore. This was the beginning of something bigger. Nora's voice broke through the tension like a bell ringing in the quiet. She'd been working in the background, gathering her own evidence, compiling a report for the IRS on unreported gift taxes, just one more nail in the coffin. Her report was ready now. Eleanor glanced at her phone as it buzzed with a notification from Nora. The report had been submitted. There would be no going back for Bradley and Mara now. The pieces were falling into place, and their fate had been sealed. But Bradley wasn't done. His grip on his wineglass tightened and his smile returned, albeit more strained. He picked up a card from the pile in front of him, tossing it onto the table with a flourish, as if to assert some kind of control over the situation. Mara smirked, watching her husband's attempt at bravado. She looked at Eleanor, almost daring her to respond, but Eleanor had already seen through the game. She leaned forward, her voice steady but firm. "That one's called fraud," she said, her eyes locking onto Bradley's. The word hung in the air like smoke from a fire, suffocating any hope of denial. Bradley's face drained of color, his smug expression cracking. For the first time tonight, he was speechless. The weight of the accusation settled on the table like a heavy stone. There were no more cards to play, no more moves to hide behind. The truth was out there, in the open, and there was nothing they could do to escape it. Mara's eyes darted to Bradley's, a flicker of panic crossing her face. For all their manipulation, for all their calculated moves, they hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected Eleanor to come for them with such precision, such quiet ferocity. Bradley swallowed hard, the weight of the moment sinking in. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He didn't know how to fight this battle. This was a different kind of war, one where money and deceit couldn't shield him from the truth. Eleanor remained silent, watching him. She didn't need to say anything else. She knew what he was thinking, knew the panic he was feeling. She had played this game longer than he had, and she had already won. June's pen paused for a moment as she looked up, meeting Eleanor's gaze. No words were exchanged, but a silent understanding passed between them. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about winning a game. This was about something deeper, something that had been building for years. Eleanor stood slowly, her movements deliberate. "Enjoy your game," she said quietly, her voice the calm before a storm. "I'm done playing." As she walked out of the room, leaving them in stunned silence, she knew they would come for her next. They would try to fight back. But there was no fighting truth. There was no escaping the inevitable. Eleanor smiled to herself as she reached the door, her mind already a step ahead of them. The storm was coming for them, and they wouldn't even see it until it was too late. The air in Eleanor's study felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were closing in around her. It was the quiet that bothered her most, the stillness that followed the game night, that followed the brunch, that followed all the careful moves she had made to expose her son and his wife. The moment of victory had passed, but there was something darker still left to unfold. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled open a drawer in her desk. There it was, the document she had been holding onto for years, a piece of paper with far more power than Bradley had ever understood. The revocation of power of attorney. 3 years ago, Bradley had quietly filed for power of attorney over her finances. It had been subtle, just a signature here, a request there, and he thought he had won, assuming that his mother, now in her 70s, would quietly accept his plans for her future. But Eleanor had seen it coming. She had always seen it coming. Now, with a single stroke of the pen, she revoked it, the document marked with her signature in a firm, deliberate hand. This, she knew, would be the first real blow. Her phone buzzed, pulling her back from the depths of thought. It was her private banker, Louis. He had been with her for years, managing her investments with precision. If anyone knew the intricacies of her wealth, it was him. He had always been discreet, reliable, until now. "Eleanor," his voice came through the line, steady, but with an undertone of something unspoken. "I've confirmed it. The recent withdrawals. They're tied to Mara's business, the so-called startup." The words stung in a way that was familiar. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, her grip tightening on the receiver. Startup. That was what Mara had called it, the nonprofit that wasn't. The business venture wrapped in a guise of charity, but a facade as thin as paper. "She claimed you funded her nonprofit, didn't she?" June's voice echoed in Eleanor's mind. Eleanor's lips pressed together, the familiar bitterness creeping back in. "She misfiled greed as charity," she replied quietly to herself. Her mind was clear, the lies becoming more transparent with each passing second. She held the phone tighter as Louis continued. "The transfers were for renovations, Eleanor. I don't need to tell you this isn't right." A cold smile tugged at the corners of Eleanor's mouth. Bradley had believed the bank could be his ally. He had thought Mara's fake nonprofit would provide them with an endless source of funds, but he hadn't counted on Eleanor's preparation, on her knowledge of every dollar that moved. The next step was already in motion. Pastor Boone had been hard at work, securing Eleanor's estate behind layers of protection. A trust shell, no visible assets, her fortune hidden from prying eyes. Her son and daughter-in-law would never find it, never get their hands on what they believed was rightfully theirs. Nora, too, had been busy in the background. She had dug through every filing Mara had ever submitted, from tax returns to nonprofit filings. A smile ghosted across Eleanor's face as she read Nora's latest message. 2 of Mara's board filings are forged. Eleanor felt a small spark of satisfaction. Every move they made, every lie they told was being unraveled at the seams. But then, the most telling moment of all arrived: Mara's attempt to withdraw funds for a renovation. The very funds she thought would be used to build her kingdom of illusion. Eleanor's fingers hovered over the screen of her phone as the notification flashed. Withdrawal request? Denied. It was perfect. In one click, Eleanor had severed their access to the family investment account. She could feel the ripple of panic beginning to creep through Mara, through Bradley. They thought they were in control. They thought they could build an empire on deceit. But it was crumbling before their eyes. Mara wouldn't give up so easily, though. Eleanor knew that. She imagined the scene in their home, Mara's frustration, her desperation as she confronted Bradley over the denied transaction. She could hear her voice rising, demanding answers, blaming him for their failure to secure what they wanted. "Eleanor," Mara would hiss, "she's doing this to us. She's pulling everything out from under us." And Bradley, caught between his wife and the consequences of his own actions, would struggle to maintain control. But there would be no way to outrun the truth now. As Eleanor sat back in her chair, a quiet sense of finality washed over her. Her son and his wife had crossed a line they couldn't undo. They had underestimated her, taken her silence as weakness. But it wasn't weakness. It was strategy. The phone buzzed again. A message from June. "Mara's calling the bank. She's about to lose it." Eleanor smiled, almost gently. "Let her," she whispered to herself. "Let her try." The game had changed, and for the first time Eleanor felt the full weight of the truth settle into place. It was no longer about wealth. It wasn't about the money they had stolen. It was about control, about power, and she was about to take it all back. The doorbell rang. Eleanor's smile faded as she stood slowly. She wasn't sure who it was. But one thing was certain: the storm was no longer just on the horizon. It was at her door. The soft hum of voices filled the parlor as guests whispered condolences to Eleanor, their faces sincere but distant. It was a blur of flower arrangements, hands pressed gently on shoulders, and the low murmur of background conversations. Yet, beneath the polite decorum of the funeral, something darker was unfolding. Something Eleanor had known would come, inevitable, like the tolling of a bell. Her sister Ruth had passed. A sudden illness, a quiet departure, leaving behind only memories and a modest estate. Eleanor had loved her deeply, but it was a different kind of grief that weighed on her heart now, one tangled in the actions of the people who gathered here today. Bradley, her son, stood at the far side of the room, looking every bit the image of concern as he spoke with distant relatives. But there was something in the way he held himself, the way his eyes flicked towards Eleanor every few moments. His grief wasn't genuine, it was calculated, as always. He was already thinking of the inheritance. It was only moments after he had shared his perfunctory words with the family that he approached Eleanor, his smile thin, too sharp. "So, who gets the estate?" His question hung in the air, too quick, too eager, as if the passing of his aunt were nothing more than a transaction to him. Eleanor met his eyes with a cold calmness, not betraying a single emotion. "I do," she said simply, her voice steady. Bradley's eyebrows furrowed ever so slightly, but he masked it quickly. "Well, I was just thinking, maybe we should have a talk about it. You know, figure out how things are going to go. It's all so sudden." Before she could respond, Mara entered the room, her footsteps light but purposeful. Eleanor caught sight of her immediately. Mara had already begun to tour the house. Her eyes flitted from one ornate decoration to the next, the glint of new furniture catching her attention like a child entering a toy store. She was snapping photos, no doubt cataloging everything, as if this home, this space, was hers for the taking. June, standing nearby, saw it too. Her voice was low, just for Eleanor's ears. "They grieve like accountants," she muttered, her words laced with dry humor. Eleanor couldn't help but nod in agreement. The audacity of it, the cruelty masked as grief. As the guests trickled in and out, exchanging pleasantries, Eleanor made her way to the side of the room where the executor stood, his face lined with the weariness of years in the job. She leaned in close, speaking with a quiet authority. "No transfers should go through without my oversight," she said, her words firm and deliberate. There was no hesitation in her voice. The executor nodded, though a flicker of concern passed over his face. "Understood, Eleanor. It'll be handled carefully. But you know how these things go. The paperwork." "Everything," she interrupted, "will be handled on my terms." It wasn't just about her sister's estate. It was about sending a message, one that Bradley and Mara would understand when they tried to make their move. Pastor Boone had been watching from a distance as he always did, his calm eyes taking in every movement, every shift in the room. Eleanor caught his gaze and gave a small nod. He would be the one to protect her legacy now, with her full blessing. It had taken time, but he had become someone she could trust completely. "I'll have Pastor Boone granted co-trustee rights," Eleanor said to the executor, her voice low but resolute. "No one else." The executor's brow furrowed. "Are you sure? The sale will be delayed, and that could cause complications." Eleanor held up her hand, cutting him off. "There will be no sale." She was already certain. Bradley had no idea what was coming for him. Nora, of course, had already been one step ahead. In the quiet of the office, she had retrieved archived copies of Eleanor's shared investments with her sister. She had spent the past few hours cross-checking, finding inconsistencies that Bradley and Mara had assumed were well hidden. Nora's text flashed through Eleanor's phone. "Found the discrepancies. We've got a strong case." Eleanor allowed herself a moment's satisfaction before glancing back at the parlor, where Bradley was engaged in another hushed conversation with the relatives. His smile had softened, but the tension in his jaw remained. He had no idea that everything he had counted on was about to unravel. By the time the probate judge arrived later that afternoon, the decision had already been made. The sale of Ruth's estate would be blocked. Bradley's face, when he heard the news, was a mixture of shock and barely controlled fury. He had come here expecting a quick win, but now it seemed his game was over. Eleanor watched from the doorway. Standing just outside the circle of family and business associates, her expression unreadable. She had played her hand so carefully, so silently. And now, it was done. Bradley's voice finally broke through the murmurs of the room, sharp and strained. "What do you mean the sale is blocked?" he demanded, his eyes flashing toward the executor, then to Pastor Boone. This isn't how it's supposed to go. I'm the one who—" Eleanor let him finish his sentence, let him stammer his way through the confrontation. But she knew. She knew he had already lost. And in that moment, there was only one thing left for him to realize. As the executor passed her a folder with the court's decision, Eleanor smiled faintly, knowing her son's fate was now sealed in ink. Bradley turned, his expression twisted in disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend the weight of the defeat that had just been handed to him. But Eleanor, calm and composed as ever, met his gaze without a word. He'd crossed the line. He just didn't know how far she was willing to go. Not yet. The first sign that Mara had overstepped came quietly, almost unnoticed. An Instagram post, like 1,000 others she had shared before, except this one carried a weight that would soon come crashing down. Excited to announce the launch of the Eleanor Whitcomb Foundation, the caption read, with a photo of Mara standing next to a glossy brochure, her smile as perfectly practiced as ever. In honor of Eleanor's lifelong commitment to the community, we're proud to be supporting youth financial literacy across Kentucky. Eleanor felt a flicker of disgust as she scrolled through the post. Her name, her image, a legacy hijacked by the very woman who had stolen from her. Mara, with her endless thirst for recognition, had woven a perfect tapestry of lies, a nonprofit designed to look like a tribute to Eleanor's work, but in reality, a front for their continuing greed. Eleanor closed her phone slowly. They thought I wouldn't notice. They had underestimated her. Again. But June noticed. Of course she did. I went through the 990 filings, June said, her voice low as she approached Eleanor in the quiet of her study. There's no record of anything. Nothing filed with the IRS, no tax-exempt status, nothing. Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile. Good. The foundations of the lie were crumbling faster than Mara had anticipated, but they needed something more than just paperwork to make it official, to expose the depths of the deception. Nora, always the one to handle the legal side with quiet precision, had already begun drafting a letter. The words on the page were simple, but they carried weight. Unauthorized use of name, image, and estate. Immediate cease and desist. It wasn't just the name of the foundation that was at stake. It was the integrity of everything Mara and Bradley had tried to build on lies. The audacity of it all. The letter was finalized, and without a moment's hesitation, Nora sent it to Mara's so-called foundation's legal department. It would take time for the full repercussions to hit, but that wouldn't matter. Mara's charade was already slipping, and Eleanor wasn't done yet. Pastor Boone had been informed. The moment he heard about the fake foundation, he had prepared his own response. The cease and desist letter came swiftly, complete with attached IRS violations. Mara would have no place to hide. Her public image, carefully cultivated, was about to be obliterated. By the end of the week, the foundation's website went dark. A silent death. The kind that Mara never saw coming. The internet had a way of erasing everything, but it also had a way of keeping records, and the truth would remain. All her promises of community outreach, education, and financial empowerment were exposed as smoke and mirrors, constructed on a foundation of greed and theft. Eleanor, from the quiet comfort of her home, took a moment to reflect. The lies had been caught, and Mara's house of cards was beginning to fall apart. But Eleanor wasn't one to dwell in victory. She didn't need the applause. She needed the final act. Her fingers moved with a practiced grace as she began to rewrite her obituary. It had always been something she'd thought about, how she would be remembered. It had never been about fame, never been about how many would mourn her when she was gone. No. Eleanor Whitcomb would be remembered for the work she did with her hands, her mind, and her integrity. The final line was simple, but it would be the one that would echo through time. Survive disgrace with ledgers, not laments. She set the pen down with satisfaction. There was no more pretending, no more illusion. The phone buzzed, a message from Bradley. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She could almost hear his voice, sharp, desperate. "Mom," he wrote, the words quick, filled with frustration. "How could you do this to me? To us?" Eleanor read the message slowly, carefully. The final act was unfolding in front of her, but this moment was too sweet, too satisfying to rush. She didn't respond right away. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, thinking for a moment about everything that had led to this point, the years of sacrifice, the quiet moments, the betrayals, the lies. When she finally tapped out her response, her fingers were steady. "You already did." And with that, she sent it. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came the call. Bradley's name lit up the screen, but she didn't pick up. She wouldn't answer. Not yet. She didn't need to. Eleanor had already won. And now it was their turn to deal with the fallout. Eleanor had always known that the house was more than just a home to her son and his wife. It had been a symbol of stability, of a life she'd built from the ground up, a sanctuary for them, or so they thought. But it was also a place where she had placed a tremendous trust, co-signing the mortgage for Bradley when he and Mara first got married. At the time, it was a gesture of faith, a belief that they could stand on their own 2 feet. She had no idea then that it would become a battleground for their greed. The deed had been in her name, until one quiet afternoon when Eleanor discovered the shift. Without her knowledge, Mara had quietly filed the title as co-owner. The down payment she had made, the years of sacrifices. She never imagined they would twist her generosity into a claim of ownership. Now, with the house under their control, they had built their empire. They had made it their own, playing off of her good nature. But they had underestimated her. They thought she was too old to notice, too worn down to care. Eleanor's fingers brushed the familiar leather of her filing cabinet. She pulled open the drawer with the same sense of determination she had carried through every battle of her life. The deed to the house, the one that had been so subtly twisted, was hidden beneath a stack of old papers, an innocent-looking document that, in truth, held the power to strip Bradley and Mara of their ill-gotten claim. With a calmness that came from years of experience, Eleanor retrieved the deed and examined it. It had her signature, her down payment, and Mara's sneaky move. But it also had a flaw, a small one, easily overlooked. A mistake, perhaps, or just a calculated risk that hadn't paid off. The house was still hers. And now it was time to reclaim what was rightfully hers. She made the call to the attorney, a simple conversation that would turn everything. Within hours, the paperwork was refiled, and Eleanor's ownership stake was solidified, 51% in her name. The legal language was clean, concise, and undeniable. Bradley and Mara would soon learn that they were no longer owners. They were tenants. Tenants in the home they thought they had taken from her. Eleanor made the call to Pastor Boone, her voice steady. "It's done," she said simply. "Please, proceed." The news hit Bradley like a brick wall. The letter from the lawyer was formal, impersonal, and devoid of mercy. It was clear. You are tenants, not owners. As the weeks passed, Bradley and Mara went through the motions of pretending it was business as usual. But underneath the surface, there was a frantic, simmering panic. They had thought they could control the narrative, but now the walls were closing in. June, ever the silent observer, had a way with words. She took a moment to post an old photograph of the house on her social media, an image of it in its prime, when it had been a symbol of family and stability. The caption was succinct, sharp: "Earn it or exit." The message was clear. Bradley and Mara had been handed everything on a silver platter, but now they were about to learn the price of that privilege. And then, as if fate were aligning itself perfectly, the notice came. It was delivered not by mail, not by courier, but by the sheriff. A formal eviction notice, the kind that left no room for negotiation. Mara was hosting one of her women in wealth brunches, an event she often used to showcase her supposed rise in status. A room full of women, socialites and influencers who believed in her carefully crafted image, all gathered to listen to her talk about empowerment and success. But as the sheriff's knock echoed through the hall, her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. The doorbell rang again, but this time it was different. The sheriff's uniform was unmistakable, the paper in his hand a symbol of the end of their charade. He handed Mara the notice with a formal word of explanation, his presence cutting through her fabricated world like a blade. Mara's face turned pale. She tried to mask the panic, to recover her composure, but the weight of the situation was too much. Her hands shook as she took the notice. In that moment, everything she had built, every stolen piece of Eleanor's legacy, collapsed in a heap at her feet. Bradley, still at the house, pacing and fuming, would not take this lying down. But it was too late. The law had already sided with Eleanor. Eleanor stood by the window of her study, watching the scene unfold in the distance. It was strange, this feeling of closure, this moment of finality. For years she had watched as her son and his wife manipulated the narrative, and now they were learning what it meant to face the consequences. But Eleanor wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about a house, a deed, or a name. It was about something deeper, something more powerful. It was about taking back control. It was about showing them that she had always known who they were, and that, in the end, the truth would win. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was Mara, her message frantic, desperate. "Mom, this isn't over. You can't just—" Eleanor didn't even need to read the rest. The final act had already played out. She stood up from her chair, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk. "I've already won," she whispered to herself, the words settling into her bones. And as the sheriff's truck pulled away from the house, a quiet satisfaction settled over her. The storm had come, and it had come for them. June had always been the quiet one, the one who observed from the sidelines, taking in every detail, making mental notes while others played their games. But now it was time for her to step into the light, to use her skills in the most deliberate way she could. As Mara and Bradley scrambled to hold on to the pieces of their crumbling empire, June took action. Her blog post was precise, calculated, like a surgeon's scalpel, cutting through the tangled web of lies that Mara and Bradley had spun. The title was simple, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 truths. What inheritance isn't. June didn't just tell the story. She backed it up with facts, receipts, documents, photos. The truth was laid out for anyone willing to see it. The lies about the house, about the so-called generosity of Mara's fake foundation, about the money they had siphoned from Eleanor's accounts. All of it was right there, black and white, impossible to deny. The photos were damning. There was the image of the check, the one Mara had conveniently misplaced years ago. A deposit that should have been a gift, but was labeled as a loan. A simple swipe of her pen that had robbed Eleanor of so much more than money. Nora, ever the meticulous one, verified every document attached to the post. She combed through the financial records, confirming that everything was legitimate, airtight. No room for escape, no loopholes to find. It was all in the open now. Within hours, the post had gone viral. The numbers on the page climbed steadily, but it was the reshare count that spoke volumes. Elder advocacy groups, financial transparency advocates, and even some well-known journalists shared the link. June's words were now in the hands of thousands, and they couldn't look away. Mara must have seen the flurry of activity. She had tried to maintain her carefully constructed image, posting photos of her brunch with hashtags like AG Empowerment and Haas Wealthy Women. But this was something else entirely. This wasn't just a simple misstep in her image. It was a complete public unraveling. Her response came quickly, a cryptic quote posted on her social media. "You can never expect to understand the price of someone else's success." The words felt hollow, meant to deflect, to offer a vague illusion of wisdom in a situation that was anything but. She knew, deep down, that she was losing, but she wouldn't admit it. Not openly. Mara turned off the comments on her post almost immediately, as if the digital silence could somehow save her. But the damage had been done. The world had seen. And the world was talking. Bradley, too, was rattled. He had tried to reach out to news outlets, to spin the narrative his way, but the calls never came. No one was interested. No one wanted to hear his side of the story. The press had moved on from his family's tragic betrayal to more pressing matters. It wasn't enough to silence him. Bradley had tried everything, but now there was no hiding, no rehearsed stories, no cameras to manipulate. As the silence hung over the house, Eleanor sat in her study, the room where all her decisions had been made. The weight of the past few weeks had not been light, but it had been necessary. This battle, this war of wills, she was winning. And in the quiet aftermath, Eleanor knew there was only one final step to complete. Sunday morning arrived, and as the bell in the church tower rang, Eleanor prepared herself for the service. The doors opened, and the familiar warmth of the congregation embraced her as she entered. The soft hum of the choir in the distance and the murmur of greetings filled the air. But it wasn't until Eleanor stepped into the sanctuary that she felt the eyes of everyone turn toward her. A standing ovation. It was subtle at first, just a few people standing up, unsure of what to do. But within moments, the entire congregation rose to their feet, applauding her. It wasn't just for the actions she had taken to reclaim what was rightfully hers. It wasn't about the house or the money. It was about the strength she had shown when no one else was watching. The quiet integrity that had carried her through the storm. She stood there, unmoving, for a long moment, absorbing the wave of support. The realization washed over her. She had done the right thing. The people she had trusted, her son and his wife, had tried to take everything from her. But in the end, the truth had won. Eleanor took a seat in the front row, her eyes still scanning the room, the faces around her, and the quiet understanding that had passed between her and the people who had stood beside her all along. They knew her for who she was, not as the woman her son had tried to control, but as the woman who had built her life on truth and integrity. The storm had passed, but its echoes would linger for a long time. The rest of the world may have been busy with their fleeting headlines and controversies, but in this moment, Eleanor was at peace. Her legacy was hers to define. As the service began, Eleanor sat back, her thoughts clearer than ever. She didn't need the spotlight or the validation from her son and his wife. In the end, it was the truth that set her free, and it was their turn to live with the consequences. The atmosphere in the study was charged with a quiet sense of finality as Pastor Boone carefully placed Eleanor's updated will on the desk. The air felt heavier now, the quiet before the storm. He'd been by her side throughout the process, every step deliberate, every move calculated. This final moment, this final act of retribution, wasn't about vengeance. It was about justice. Eleanor's will was no longer just a piece of legal documentation. It was a statement of who she had become after the years of deceit, betrayal, and silent endurance. The terms were simple, but they carried weight far beyond the legal jargon. 80% to financial literacy programs. That was her legacy. Helping others, protecting them from the kind of financial manipulation that had defined her son and daughter-in-law's life. The remaining 20%, though, was for someone else. Someone who had always stood by her. Someone who had been loyal when it seemed like no one else would be. June, the quiet observer. The one who had never wavered. Eleanor felt the weight lift off her shoulders as she signed the final page. This wasn't about punishing Bradley and Mara. This was about rewriting the rules of the game. It was about giving to the people who had earned it, and taking away from those who had tried to steal from her. With a final stroke of the pen, the deed was done. The certified letter went out to Bradley and Mara soon after. It was cold, impersonal, and exact. You've been removed. 3 simple words that would have a monumental impact. There was no room for argument, no chance for appeal. They were no longer part of Eleanor's legacy. The no contest clause locked them out of any possibility of reclaiming what they believed was their birthright. Bradley must have seen the letter first. It wasn't the kind of news you could soften. His response was swift, frantic, a mix of disbelief and outrage. The letter had arrived like a thunderclap, and Mara's silence was almost as loud as Bradley's anger. Mara's friends, those who had once whispered about her supposed cut, the money that was rightfully hers, fell silent. There was no grand rebuttal from her, no social media outburst, no witty deflections. Instead, she posted nothing for an entire week. The calculated silence was just as revealing as the lies she had spun. Eleanor didn't care about their silence. She had already won. Nora, working behind the scenes as always, ensured that everything was locked in place. The estate, now held in an irrevocable trust, would not fall into the wrong hands. There was no wiggle room, no loopholes, no way for Bradley and Mara to claw their way back into what they had lost. The truth was set in stone. But the ripple effect would continue. The consequences for Mara and Bradley would unfold in ways they hadn't anticipated. Eleanor had also made one final anonymous donation, a generous sum to an elder protection pack. The money would help prevent others from falling victim to the same kind of financial manipulation she had endured for years. It felt like the right way to end things. A small act of quiet rebellion that sent a message to anyone who might be watching. And as for Bradley, the state had already begun its own investigation into his affairs. The IRS had started auditing him for prior tax manipulations, something Mara had always turned a blind eye to, but now it would be impossible to hide. The cracks in their financial empire were widening, and there was nowhere left to hide. Eleanor sat in her study, the room as calm and quiet as it had always been, but something had shifted. The battle was over. The truth had been exposed, and now the pieces of her life, her legacy, were in place. Outside, the world was moving forward, oblivious to the quiet war that had been waged and won. But inside, Eleanor was at peace. The storm had passed, and she was finally free. She stood up, walking toward the window that overlooked the backyard. The same view she had always had, the same world that had always been hers. Only now, it felt different. She didn't need to keep fighting. She had already secured her future. And as for Bradley and Mara, they would have to face the consequences of their own actions, with no one to blame but themselves. Eleanor let the breeze wash over her face as she stood there, watching the sunlight spill across the horizon. There was no need for applause, no need for any kind of recognition. She had already written her own story, and it was theirs to deal with now. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across Eleanor's study. She sat at her desk, the calm before the storm settling into her bones. The battle had been fought, the pieces had fallen into place, and now all that remained was the final act. It was time for Bradley and Mara to see the consequences of their actions, not just in courtrooms or bank accounts, but in the very heart of their home, their lives. The bound packet arrived just before noon. It was thick with documentation, receipts, signed affidavits, financial timelines, and a final statement of truth. The kind of truth that couldn't be ignored, dismissed, or twisted. Bradley wouldn't be able to spin this one. It was all laid bare, page after page, a systematic unveiling of everything they had stolen from her. As she opened the packet, Eleanor's fingers brushed over the top sheet. She had waited for this moment, the moment when they would have no more excuses, no more lies to tell. She smiled softly to herself as she carefully placed a handwritten note inside the packet. "This is what repayment looks like," she wrote. A simple statement, but it carried the weight of years of silent sacrifice and betrayal. Eleanor sealed the envelope with a finality that reverberated in the stillness of the room. She wouldn't be there to see their reaction. She didn't need to be. The truth would hit them just as hard without her presence. The letter was mailed. The final step had been taken. A few hours later, the phone rang. It was Mara. Eleanor could almost hear the panic in her voice, the same desperation that had marked every other attempt they'd made to control the situation. Mara's refusal to acknowledge the truth was almost laughable. "It's just a set of lies," she told herself, as though repeating it could make it true. But Eleanor had known all along. Mara's silence was only a reflection of how deeply she feared what was coming. Bradley, too, would try to fight, but Eleanor had already ensured there was no way out. The weight of the evidence was too heavy to ignore, too undeniable. Every transaction, every withdrawal, every shady financial move was documented, and the no-contest clause in the will had sealed their fate. Legally, they had no recourse. Mara, refusing to acknowledge her defeat, quietly contacted a lawyer. She probably hoped that a well-worded legal threat could erase what had been set in motion. But it was too late. The lawyer's words came back like a cold slap of reality. "You're too late." She sealed it all. Eleanor's lips curved into a smile. There was no escaping this. No last-minute loophole they could slip through. They had underestimated her from the beginning. They thought they could silence her with their manipulation, their false appearances. June's message came through next, a short and simple text. "It's done. They know." Eleanor allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She didn't need more than that. Her enemies had seen it. They couldn't deny it anymore. Meanwhile, Nora, always the meticulous one, took the time to frame the envelope. She placed it delicately on her mantle. Proof isn't loud. It's permanent, a sentiment that had carried them all this far. Nothing could erase the truth. Not now. Not ever. As the day drifted toward evening, Eleanor sat in her study, her thoughts as calm as the room around her. Her work was done. There were no more games to play, no more lies to untangle. She had done what she needed to do, and the rest would unfold on its own. The evening sun began to set, casting a golden light across the room. Eleanor walked to the kitchen, her movements deliberate, steady. She opened the cabinet, retrieved a glass, and poured herself a small measure of whiskey, her quiet toast to victory. She sat back down at her desk, holding the glass in her hands, the warm amber liquid reflecting the fading light. She wasn't looking for applause. She wasn't waiting for anyone to recognize her. This was her moment. Her peace. Peace never begged for applause. She whispered softly to herself. The words she had often said in the silence of her thoughts now finally spoken aloud. Eleanor sat in the quiet of her study, the sun sinking lower in the sky, and allowed herself to savor the stillness. It was over. The storm had come and gone, and all that was left was the calm that followed. Bradley and Mara would never understand the true cost of their greed. They would fight. They would scream. But in the end, they would have nothing. Not the house. Not the money. And certainly not the peace that came with knowing they had lost. As Eleanor sipped her drink, she smiled to herself. It was their turn to live with the consequences. Eleanor's name had been her legacy. It was something she had built piece by piece. Her integrity, her hard work, her quiet contributions to the world. She had never cared for recognition, never sought to flaunt what she had accomplished. But for Bradley and Mara, her name had been an asset, something they believed they could use for their own gain, without understanding the depth of what it meant. It was time to put an end to that. The legal documents were filed. A name-use restriction clause in her estate would ensure that neither Bradley nor Mara could cash in on her likeness, her name, or any association with her in business, charity, or media. It was a simple clause, but one that carried profound consequences for them. They would never again be able to masquerade as beneficiaries of her work, of her reputation, not in public, not in private. Eleanor had removed their ability to profit off of what they had stolen. Mara didn't see it coming. She had worked hard to build her brand, to weave herself into the fabric of what she thought was Eleanor's legacy. But now, everything she had worked for was collapsing piece by piece as she found out her access to that very name was blocked. A podcast, one she had been invited to for an inspirational episode about wealth building, was the first casualty. The network had received the legal notice just hours before the recording was scheduled. The podcast episode was canceled without so much as an apology. The hosts, who had once welcomed Mara as the embodiment of self-made success, were now pulling away from the image she had so carefully cultivated. When news of the cancellation reached the social media world, Mara's carefully polished facade cracked just a little more. She posted a cryptic message, but the damage had already been done. The press had turned on her, and now even the smallest platforms were distancing themselves from her. Pastor Boone, too, stood by Eleanor, unyielding in his support. He posted publicly, "Eleanor chose accountability over appearances." It was a statement that didn't need to be explained. The message was clear to anyone who knew the family dynamic. It wasn't just about a name, it was about living with integrity and facing the consequences of your actions. The fallout continued. June, ever the meticulous record keeper, updated the family tree. She added a footnote to the history, a quiet testament to the legacy of Eleanor Whitcomb and the reality of what had happened to the name once it had been exploited by those who didn't understand its weight. Mara was removed from 2 charity boards, her name now deemed a reputational risk. Her association with Eleanor, once a symbol of power and status, had now become a liability. But it was the nameplate outside the local finance hall that truly symbolized the final shift. The building that had once been named after the Whitcomb family, a symbol of their influence in Lexington, now bore a new name. The words, Whitcomb Center, in honor of Eleanor, gleamed in polished brass, a reminder of what had been lost in the scramble for control. Bradley and Mara could no longer claim the legacy that wasn't theirs. They were left with nothing but the rubble of their own making, their attempts to mold the family's name into something they could exploit completely undone. Eleanor sat quietly in her study, watching as the final pieces fell into place. Her legacy had been preserved, not just in the family name, but in the way she had lived her life. She had done what was right, and in doing so, she had ensured that her name would not be tarnished by those who had sought to profit from it. The quiet satisfaction settled in her chest like the final contented sigh after a storm had passed. But there was more to it than just the name. Eleanor knew that Bradley and Mara would continue to fight, to claw at the remnants of what they thought was theirs. But the truth, the real legacy she had built, would never be theirs to claim. She picked up her glass, taking a slow sip, watching the sun set through the window. The air felt different now, lighter. Her fight had been about more than just money or possessions. It had been about integrity. And in the end, that was something that couldn't be stolen. The storm had come for them. It had exposed the lie they had lived, and now there was nothing left but the aftermath. As Eleanor sat back in her chair, she couldn't help but smile. It was their turn to live with the consequences. She had already lived with hers, and emerged victorious. The night was perfect. June had meticulously planned every detail of the dinner, and the atmosphere in her home reflected the precision of her character. Elegant, deliberate, and quietly powerful. The long table was set with fine china, crystal glasses gleaming under the soft golden glow of overhead lights. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her posture poised and proud, a woman who had not just survived, but had emerged stronger from the trials she'd faced. The guests were not family, at least not in the conventional sense. These were the people who had truly understood her journey, mentors, lawyers, survivors. A group of individuals who had stood by her through the darkest of times, when the storm had seemed insurmountable. There were no pretensions here, no games to be played. just the quiet celebration of what had been earned, not assumed. June, ever the perfectionist, ensured that everything was exactly as it should be. Her smile was warm but purposeful, her eyes gleaming with a sense of satisfaction. She watched as the others took their seats, settling into their roles at the table. Eleanor was at peace, the weight of her past lifted, her legacy secured. As the first course was served, the phones around the room buzzed and hummed. Social media, as always, was quick to catch wind of anything significant. Photos of the dinner were shared, tagged, and reshared in a flurry of activity. People marveled at the elegant gathering, the powerhouse of women who had built their success on integrity and hard work. But not everyone was invited to this celebration. Mara had tried. Of course she had. In her desperate attempt to recapture any vestige of her old life, she had sent an RSVP under her maiden name, thinking she could slip back in, pretending that the betrayals hadn't happened, that her name hadn't been erased from the Whitcomb legacy. It didn't take long for June to decline the invitation. The message was short, polite, and final. "We've moved on." Mara had tried to force her way back into a world that she no longer belonged to, but June's refusal was a quiet but resounding declaration of boundaries that couldn't be crossed. Eleanor, serene in her composure, made a single toast as the evening progressed. She raised her glass, the movement slow and deliberate, her voice steady as she addressed the room. "To boundaries written in ink, not wishes." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and yet light in the truth they carried. This was not a victory to be flaunted, but one to be understood. Her legacy was no longer up for debate. No one could take it from her now. Nora, who had been a quiet but constant presence by Eleanor's side, stood from her seat. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, elegant box, the kind that held a meaningful token. She handed it to Eleanor with a nod. Eleanor opened it carefully. Inside was a silver fountain pen, its design simple yet beautiful, like everything in her life. She met Nora's eyes, recognizing the depth of the gift. "For every silence you signed away," Nora said softly, her voice filled with respect and quiet admiration. Eleanor ran her fingers over the pen, feeling the weight of it in her palm. She didn't need any more words. This was a symbol of everything she had endured and everything she had reclaimed. A quiet reminder that the truth, no matter how long it takes, always prevails. As the dinner carried on, the laughter and conversation flowed easily, but a small part of Eleanor's mind was occupied by the image of Bradley, somewhere far away, watching the live stream of the event on his phone. She didn't need to know what he was thinking. She could almost feel his frustration through the screen, the burning sense of injustice that he had been removed from her life, from the legacy he thought was his. He watched, silent, as the images flashed before him. But no matter how many times he replayed the scenes, no matter how many times he tried to rewind, the message would remain the same. The legacy he had taken for granted was no longer his to claim. Eleanor's photo with June began to make its rounds on social media. The caption was simple but striking. "Earned, not assumed." It was a reminder to everyone who had been part of this story that nothing in life was given. It was all a matter of what one earned through hard work, integrity, and an unbreakable sense of self. The post went viral. It wasn't just a photo, it was a declaration, a closing of a chapter, and the beginning of a new one. Eleanor's strength, her quiet dignity, was now on display for the world to see. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a force. As the evening wore on, Eleanor leaned back in her chair, content with the moment, content with the people around her, and content with the life she had built. The storm had come, and it had passed. The pieces of her world were now firmly in place. She didn't need to look back anymore. The future was hers to shape, and no one would take that from her. And somewhere in the distance, Bradley and Mara would have to learn to live with the consequences of their choices. The world would no longer remember them for what they had taken, but for what they had lost. Eleanor's legacy was untouchable. The coastal condo was everything Eleanor had ever wanted. It was smaller than the sprawling house she had once shared with Bradley, but it felt like the embodiment of freedom, open, serene, and entirely hers. The ocean stretched out before her, vast and endless, a reminder that the past had washed away, leaving only a quiet horizon to look toward. The condo had been paid for in full. Eleanor hadn't hesitated. She had known for years that she would downsize, that she would create a space of her own after everything had settled. It was a quiet rebellion against the life she'd once lived, a life that had been built on expectations and the weight of others' desires. This place, this simple, sun-drenched retreat, was her sanctuary. The future she had fought for was finally here, and it was hers to shape. June had been the first to visit, bringing with her more than just a sense of camaraderie. She had brought purpose. They spent hours talking about how to channel the lessons they had learned, about making sure the next generation was equipped to face the financial battles that had so nearly destroyed Eleanor's life. "I've been thinking," June said one afternoon, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "I want to start teaching community finance workshops. In your name." Eleanor had smiled. The idea resonated deeply. June was the one who understood that wealth was not just a number in a bank account. It was about empowerment, education, and self-determination. The workshops would teach people how to protect themselves from the kind of manipulation Eleanor had faced, how to reclaim control over their financial futures. They would help them build legacies of their own. "Do it," Eleanor said. "Let the name live on in a way that means something real." Soon, June's workshops were a success, growing in reach and impact. Eleanor watched from her condo as the name she had once shared with Bradley and Mara became something more than just a symbol of wealth. It was a symbol of independence, knowledge, and strength. Meanwhile, Bradley's empire began to crumble. His business, once seen as a thriving enterprise, fell apart under the weight of back tax penalties. The state had finally caught up with him. It had been inevitable, really. The years of tax evasion, the shifting of funds, the shady deals, it had all come to light. As the business folded, Bradley was left with nothing but debt and the sharp sting of failure. The money he thought was his, the life he thought he'd built on stolen foundations, slipped through his fingers like sand. Mara, too, faced the consequences of her actions. She had tried to reinvent herself after the collapse, opening a coaching page to empower others, as she so often claimed. But it didn't take long for her credentials to be questioned. A report surfaced, exposing her false claims and exaggerated qualifications. The coaching page was shut down, the lie laid bare for everyone to see. The woman who had once thought she could buy her way into success was now left with nothing but the wreckage of her own making. In the stillness of her study, Eleanor sat at her desk, reviewing one last document, the final transfer approval. It was a formality now, the last piece of paperwork to secure everything she had worked for. Her fingers moved slowly, deliberately, over the page as she signed her name with a quiet confidence. It felt like the end of a chapter, but Eleanor knew it was only the beginning. The trust she had established would ensure that her legacy would remain intact, untouched by the hands of those who had tried to claim it for themselves. Her name would no longer be a commodity to be sold or stolen. It would stand for something more. It would stand for accountability. Later that afternoon, Pastor Boone arrived, as he often did, bearing a tray of fresh tea. His calm presence was a comfort, a reminder that, while the world had changed around her, some things remained steady. They sat together, the soft clink of teacups the only sound in the quiet room. Eleanor signed the final trust release, the last signature she would ever need to make. She set the pen down with a soft finality. Pastor Boone looked at her, his expression unreadable. "It's done, Eleanor," he said, his voice warm with respect. Eleanor smiled faintly, the weight of everything they had fought for settling into her chest. "No one erased me," she whispered, the words feeling like an affirmation. "They just watched me rewrite." The air outside the condo was crisp, the salt of the sea filling her lungs. The waves crashed against the shore, relentless and constant. Eleanor sat back in her chair, her gaze drifting out the window to the horizon. She was free, and the future she had fought for, the one she had earned, was finally hers. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room, Eleanor felt the weight of the years fall away. The storm had passed, and there was nothing left to prove. She had written her own story, and it was one that would be remembered, not for the battles she had fought, but for the life she had built in the aftermath. There would be no more questions, no more doubts. The truth had been written in ink, and it could never be erased. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt at peace. The future was hers to shape, and no one could take that from her. She took a deep breath and smiled, knowing that the world, her world, was finally right where it belonged. The National Ethics in Wealth Summit was held in a sleek, glass and steel conference hall overlooking the city skyline. It was the type of venue that spoke of influence, of a power that came not from wealth, but from the integrity that built it. June stood at the podium, her presence commanding the room. She was poised, confident, an embodiment of everything Eleanor had taught her. The crowd was rapt with attention, hanging on every word she spoke, and as she flipped through the slides behind her, the first one caught their eyes with unflinching clarity: family financial entitlement. Eleanor watched from her coastal condo, the vast ocean spread before her like an endless canvas. There was no social media for her, no flashing lights or endless updates. She had turned off her phone and opened only real mail, the letters that mattered, the ones that held her future and her peace. This was her world now. No distractions, just truth. She had never been one for public recognition, but June had insisted. The impact Eleanor had made on June's life, and on the lives of countless others, was too important to remain in the shadows. June was right. This was about more than just the past. It was about the future. At the summit, June's words were precise, thoughtful, each one delivered with the weight of the lessons they had learned together. The foundation they had started in Eleanor's name was no longer just a project. It had grown into something that would protect people, ensure that the elderly were no longer exploited or left in the dark by greedy relatives or cunning financial predators. The fraud detection tool they launched, appropriately named Eleanor, was now the gold standard in elder protection, a quiet nod to the woman who had fought tooth and nail to ensure that others would never have to face the same betrayal she had. But Eleanor's legacy was not just about tools or foundations. It was about the message that had stayed with June through every hardship, every legal battle, every moment of doubt: integrity over appearance. Back at the condo, Eleanor sipped her tea, her gaze distant but clear. She didn't need to be at that summit. She didn't need applause. What mattered was that her story, her life, was being woven into something greater than herself. The truth of her name was secure, and with each passing day it was becoming harder for anyone to erase what had been built. Later that day, a letter arrived, sealed with a finality that could not be ignored. It was addressed to Mara, the name written in bold, unmistakable letters. The message within was brief, but it carried a weight that would echo in her life forever. Return is no longer accepted. Eleanor had already made peace with the fact that Mara would never truly understand the depth of the betrayal. There was no apology she needed, no acknowledgement from her. Mara's loss was far greater than just financial. It was the loss of her ability to ever share in the legacy that Eleanor had built. As the final days of this chapter unfolded, Pastor Boone, ever the steady presence in Eleanor's life, arrived with the final part of the story. He read aloud the obituary Eleanor had written for herself, her own words, her own truth. She never raised her voice. She raised standards. A soft smile tugged at the corners of Eleanor's lips. It was simple, yes, but it was also everything. She had never been one for loud gestures or public displays. Her strength lay in her silence, in the quiet way she had fought back, in the unyielding standards she had held herself and others to. And in the silence that followed the reading of those words, Eleanor felt the weight of it all. She wasn't just a survivor. She was the force that had rewritten the rules of the game. As the days passed, her legacy spread. June continued to teach the workshops. The Eleanor fraud detection tool continued to safeguard vulnerable people, and the name Whitcomb was once again synonymous with integrity, strength, and resilience. But for Bradley and Mara, the world no longer cared about their lies. They could not manipulate their way back into the life they had thought was theirs. The receipts, the paperwork, the legal protections, everything had been signed, sealed, and delivered. Eleanor's world, built on truth, stood firm. And as for her son and his wife, they would have to live with the consequences of their greed, their entitlement. Their story was one of loss, while Eleanor's was one of quiet, unwavering power. As she sat by her window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Eleanor smiled softly. She had already won. And the final line of her story had already been written. At dinner, my son said he gave all my money to his wife, but the receipt said otherwise. It wasn't just a statement. It was the truth, and no one could take that from her.